Certainly good to see everyone here this morning. This wonderful occasion today that we can be together and really learn from God, learn from His Word, and be thankful for all that He's done for us. God is the God of second chances. He's the God of another chance. And God used people who sinned and made poor decisions. And God can still use people who have flaws and weaknesses. If he didn't, then that would be bad news, wouldn't it? Because in Proverbs chapter 20, verse 9, it says, "Who can say, I've kept my heart pure, I'm clean without sin?" Well, that's a rhetorical question. No one can say that. Paul says, "For we have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God." So it's wonderful that God uses us, even though we may not be perfect. We aren't perfect. And one of the reasons that He does is He's got incredible patience. That's actually Psalm 86, verse 15. "But you, my Lord, are a God of compassion and mercy. You are very patient and full of faithful love." It's kind of echoed by the prophet Micah when he says, who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity, overlooking the sin of the few, remaining for His inheritance. He doesn't hold on to His anger forever. He delights in faithful love. The Bible gives many examples of people given a second chance, like Peter, Jonah. You can think of Mark. Remember how Barnabas stepped forward for Mark? David and others. And one other, Samson. We're going to look at one of these men this morning. What do people do when they have a second chance? I think God works through people. And I saw this story about this person who was this officer who received a call that there was a man on the tracks, train tracks. And so he was called to go over there and get him off of those tracks. And so he went over. And you can see that he's there. He's trying to drag that man off of the tracks. He's resisting. He's being very stubborn about it. And he can hear the train coming. And that man is just so rebellious, so stubborn. He even pulls back the smaller officer, tries to drag him onto the track, but he is able to get him off in just the nick of time. Well, I look at that, and that officer said that I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. And when he's pulling on me, I've got to give it one more try. One more try. And by doing that, he was able to get him off. Now, he did later apologize and thanked him for what he did. But the question is, what will he do with his life now? In a sense, you can think about God. He's pulling and pulling people, trying to get them off the wrong track, a track of destruction. He's pulling. And so often how he's pulling is he's using his people to do that with others. Because God was so patient with one man who had flaws and weaknesses, He was able to use him to the point where this man eventually committed his life to God in a way that he was willing to even die for God and His people. It came to that point in his life. Who was he? Samson, which means like the sun. Well, he was like the sun to the Israelites when you compare him with the Philistines. Samson, grew and the Lord blessed him. The Spirit of the Lord began to stir him while he was in Mahanaim, Dan, between Zorah and I know you want to find out where that is. You can kind of see Jerusalem there. This would have been the area right there. Toward the end of Samson's life, the Philistines finally captured him. Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding in the prison. Now, why is it? God wasn't finished with Samson yet. In the end, there was kind of a hidden strength that surfaced. Good overcomes evil because God is the God of second chances. And God didn't give up on Samson. And God does not give up on people. That's why Jesus hasn't returned yet. Peter says this, he says, the Lord is not slow in keeping his promise. As some understand slowness, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. When we look at the life of Samson, it's a mixed life. It's a mixture of strength and weakness, good and bad. He was certainly a human with a lot of frailties. So we find that he's been described as the strongest man to have ever lived, but also the weakest. When we think of Samson and his conflict with the Philistines, weakness is about the last thing that comes to our mind. At Ascalon, he killed 30 Philistines. At Timnah, he caught 300 foxes, set their tails on fire, and burned up the crops of the Philistines. At Lehi, something remarkable took place. He allowed 3,000 Israelites to hand him over to the Philistines. And then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he killed 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey. So he reached out, he took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Now, couldn't he have done that by himself? No, God empowered him to do that. Another example we find. He realized that the Philistines were waiting to ambush him at Gaza. And in the middle of the night, he decides to get up and leave the city before they ambush him. And when he arrived at the city gates, they were locked. There was no way to get out. But he found a way. He just picked up the gate. Then he got up, took hold of the doors of the city gate together with the 2 posts and tore them loose, bar and all. He lifted them to his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Now, some scholars estimate that he carried that for about 30 miles to the top of the hill facing Hebron. Samson means like the sun. And in a sense, he brought sunlight to the Israelites who were facing and be defeated by the oppressive, evil, vile Philistines. We'll examine several aspects of this morning. His physical strength, his mental strength, his spiritual strength, and his spiritual weakness. In our culture, he has many characteristics that people would admire when it comes to physical strength. He was a strong man. Not that he pumped iron or was a bodybuilder, but he demonstrated his strength in a popular, secular, worldly ways. In the minds of many, a strong man means you look out for number one, which means himself. And his motto would probably have been, if it feels good, do it. He knows how to get what he wants. He jokes, tells riddles, mocks, and even deceives. He's not afraid of anyone or anything. And he's confident and arrogant, knowing that he's strong. He's independent, thinking he doesn't need anyone's help. He's no pushover. He's not going to let anyone push him around, even if hundreds of Philistines. His arrogance gets him into trouble with 3 different Philistine women because he's thoughtless, he's hasty, he's impulsive. He is not, I don't think we could say, this is not a humble man. We live in a culture that puts a meager value on humility. Our culture doesn't give a merit badge for a person who's very humble. They don't do it. And we learn from the media, news, social platforms, movies to get ahead. You do that either by climbing the ladder of success or getting all the freebies you can get. To look out for number one. To win through intimidation. Which is one thing Samson did. Humility means that we don't run the world. We don't have all the answers. We know our limitations, but it seems like Samson didn't know his limitations. He had them. But with all of this being said so far about Samson, where do we find him listed? Where do we find him listed? The Hall of Faith, or the Heroes of Faith. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms. Some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put in prison, which is what happened to Samson. Yes, this is the man that we've been talking about, who's listed in the Hall of Faith, or Heroes of Faith. And we'll come back to the reason why I think he's listed there. Samson's parents raised him as a Nazarite. The angel of the Lord came to his parents. He's to be dedicated as a Nazarite to God from the time he's born until his death. That wasn't necessarily the most common thing for a lifetime to take a Nazarite vow. It involves several things about not drinking anything from the fruit of the vine. Not cutting your hair. Not touching any dead body of any kind. But remember, he violated these vows. Where did he get that honey that time? Remember, it was in the lion. But we find that his parents, they raised him, and his purpose was given. He was set apart to God from birth, and he will begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. Samson was to live as a Nazarite until he died. And one who took a Nazarite vow did it for a while, usually not for a lifetime, as I mentioned. But we find that also some of these stipulations were applied to his parents, to his mother. She was not to drink anything from the fruit of the vine. And God was using the parental example in rearing Samson. Samson's parents were the kind of people who could cultivate a champion. And they were several things you can see about them. They were good examples to him. They were humble. When Manoah, his father, found out that an angel had come, he wanted to find that angel again to tell him how to raise this boy that they're going to have. Now, does a proud and arrogant person need to do that or think they do that? No. They think they know it all. They don't need any advice. But he knew that they did. He was asking those questions. We also find that they were caring. So here we find Samson, he's grown, and he supposedly falls in love with a Philistine woman, and he wanted his dad to arrange his marriage to her. This is what his dad said. Isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives or among all your people? But you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife? But when we look at this, they were trying to train him in the right, train a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not turn from it. Well, he eventually came back to it, to that training, before his life ended. He will begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. This was about to start. You can see that he had a mental strength about him. One of the examples briefly mentioned before is that he was able to catch 300 foxes, set their tails on fire, burned the crops of the Philistines. Now, how in the world he could catch 300 foxes? Well, he couldn't do it by himself. God had to help him to do that. He discovered the reason he did it, that his wife had been given to another man, and he was very upset, and he decided to get even. And so he went out, he caught these hundreds of foxes, and he tied them tail to tail in pairs. Was this guy afraid of anything? Let the foxes loose in the standing grain of the Philistines. He burned all the shocks and standing grain together with the vineyards and the olive groves. And when the Philistines found out why Samson had done that, now do you think they're cruel, evil, vile, vicious, malicious people? When they found out why Samson did this, they burned his wife and his wife's father to death. And so we can get an idea of what kind of people the Philistines were. 3,000 Israelites bound Samson with new ropes. The Israelites were afraid of the Philistines. They wanted Samson. They came to Samson. And he allowed himself to be handed over to the enemies, to the 3,000 Israelites. He allowed the 3,000 Israelites to bound him with these ropes. And then he allowed them to take him to the Philistines and turn him over to them. But when the Philistines began to howl, shout, most likely with joy at his capture, the Bible states the following: the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power. The ropes on his arms became like charred flax, and the bindings dropped from his hands. Finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. He demonstrates a simple heroism of physical strength against a corrupt, cruel, wicked enemy. Without God's help, he couldn't have done this. And so we look at him. There are several things that we can say about his mental strength or toughness. He never gave up. He had 20 lonely years as a judge up against the force of the evil Philistines. He endured the catastrophe of betrayal, mutilation, and malicious mockery by his enemy without breaking. He fought when no one else would fight. He never did give in or give up in opposing them. He would fight when no one else would fight. And he knew who the enemy was. He inflicted the countless blows against the ruthless, evil enemy, the Philistines. Now we find that he also had spiritual strength. The writer of the book of Hebrews saw good in him and listed him as one in the hall of faith, a man who had faith. We're going to look for the good now. He who seeks good finds goodwill. And so his spiritual strength, I think he had a concern for others. He was poor in spirit. He had a God-given ability or talent. When we look at this and how he had a concern for others, remember the Israelites came? 3,000 of them came to turn him over. He could have fought against them, but he didn't. Because he was concerned about them. That's why he was fighting against the Philistines, the evil Philistines. Not to be fighting against his own people. And probably by allowing himself to be captured and taken to the Philistines, he probably saved some lives in doing that. So in a sense, he had a concern for others. And we find that he also in this having a concern for others, we need to have a concern for others as well, don't we? And so the Apostle Paul, when he writes to the church at Philippi, he says this: each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also the interests of others. Now, I put this down. He was poor in spirit, poor in spirit. He realized his need for God. Now, he rarely shows this need, but he fully realized the need at the end of his life. And another time is after slaying these 1,000 Philistines with that jawbone of a donkey, he prays because he was very thirsty. He cried out to the Lord, "You have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" In his prayer, he acknowledges that God gave him the victory over the Philistines. Not himself, but it was God. Then the Lord answered his prayer. He opened the hollow place in Lehi, and water came out of it. And when Samson drank, his strength returned, and he revived. So we too can be mentally revived and refreshed when we put our trust in Jesus. We're to serve him and practice what he says. And when we do, we'll survive any storms we face in this life. There's a certain proverb. Read it carefully. Have no fear of sudden disaster or of the ruin that overtakes the wicked. But what is this sudden disaster? It could be like the ruin that overtakes the wicked. For the Lord will be your confidence. The word confidence is the same word we use for trust. Trust in the Lord. He will be your confidence. He'll be there for you. He will keep your foot from being snared. We may face something like sudden disaster or it seems like ruin. But we're not going to be snared by it and be kept down and give up. Because the Lord is our confidence. He will keep us from being snared in that way and captured by disaster and ruin. And so we also see that he had a God-given ability or talent. He had a great ability or talent from God, which was his strength. Suddenly a young lion came roaring toward him. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power, so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands. No man can do that by himself. The power came from God himself. Even though he had this strength or gift from God, he took it for granted. And we are to continue to grow and use the gifts that we have to serve others and to glorify God. Peter puts it this way: each one should use whatever gift he has received to serve others, faithfully administering God's grace in its various forms. He didn't say some people have a gift. He said each one should use whatever gift he has. Each person has a gift. I'm reminded of the parable that Jesus gave of the talents. A talent was worth 15 years' wages. 15 years, when you took monetary terms about it. One person was given 1 talent, another 2, another 5. Large sums. And he's talking about the abilities in that parable. Each person has an ability. And we are to use that ability that's been given to us for the service of God. And if we're trying to figure out what that is, just keep serving and we'll find out that we get better. We're better at some things than we are at others. But let's serve. There was Samson and Delilah. You've heard of the story. And she kept begging him, nagging him. Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued. He told her 3 different ways. None of them worked. And he knew what she was trying to do. But she kept nagging, she kept prodding him, and he finally admits that no razor had ever come to his head, and that is where his strength lies. Now, does that sound like a very wise decision? After what she's been doing, we've seen her character, we've seen what she's trying to succeed in doing. Each time he gave her an example of how he could lose his strength, and then the Philistines would show up. And he finally says this: he may have thought he was invincible. There's a proverb that Solomon wrote that he could have been thinking about Samson here. A prudent man sees danger and takes refuge, but the simple keep going and they suffer for it. Well, he suffered because she took a razor to his head while he was in deep sleep. He must have been in deep sleep. He didn't have any hair. They come in, they subdue him. And then he is taken. The Philistines take him, and when the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, "Our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste our land and multiplied our slain." They gouged out his eyes. They took him to prison. Then there's this big festival that's taking place in the temple of Dagon. There are 3,000 of these antagonistic, malicious, wicked enemies in the temple of Dagon. They're there. They want to bring out Samson to mock him, to make fun of him. And he's brought out among them. So during that time, he has no strength. Well, he's gaining some of his hair back, but he knows where the true strength lies. It's not really the hair. It's in trusting God and obeying what he says. And so he turns to God, and God gives him another opportunity to fulfill his mission. The author of the book of Hebrews must have had this event in his mind. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, "Almighty Lord, please remember me. Oh God, please strengthen me just once more. And let me with one blow get revenge of the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Then Samson reached toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood, bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple and the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. There's something actually sweet that came out of him. Samson died in this way, praying to God. That was the sweet thing that came out of him. He had his second chance. He became a true man of faith. Samson fully turned to God, which transformed his life from stench to sweetness. He changed, he repented. What began with an arrogant, self-absorbed, feel good, do-it attitude turned into selfless sacrifice. What began with rage, violence, and if you push me, I'll push back attitude turned into giving his own life as a sacrifice to defeat Israel's enemy and honor God. He knew the power came from God. He had faith that God would use him one last time. So out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. There was something sweet that came out of him. That total commitment that he had to God at the end of his life. We too are to deny ourselves, take up our cross daily, and follow Jesus. And when we turn to God, things change. Life changes. We change. Last Thursday, as Debbie and I were walking in a pond near our house, We're walking along, and we're coming to this bridge. And on this bridge, I didn't notice, Debbie noticed. I'm not that observant. I wasn't looking down and observing everything. She sees birds and all kinds of things that I don't see. But as we're walking there, we see, she pointed it out to me, this beautiful little rock. And I really like the word on that rock, don't you? Hope. It reminds me of what Paul wrote to the church at Rome. He says, for everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the Scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we may have hope. Well, we've seen in this story, we've seen in the story of Samson that he did have endurance. Here he was a weak, flawed man, but he never gave up. It's the story of his endurance. And we see it's also, it provides encouragement for us, because here God is using this man. God doesn't just use perfect people. He will use us. We can continue to grow and become stronger, not physically, but spiritually, and be more effective servants for the Lord. And that's the hope for us. We don't have to wait till our last day in which we're going to give total commitment to Jesus. We don't have to do that. We can do it today, right now. Of course, we don't know what our last day is, but we can do it now, right now. We don't have to wait. We can have that kind of hope. Jesus says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their